As the 71st session of the United Nations General Assembly wraps up in New York, who will be the next Secretary General? Hello, everyone. I'm Asiye Namdar, sitting in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. The global challenges are daunting: hunger, gender equality, and climate change among them. So last year, the United Nations laid out what it calls Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, an ambitious 15-year universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity. Later, we'll talk with two philanthropists joining in that effort. But first, whoever succeeds Ban Ki-moon as the next UN Secretary General will inherit those challenges and much more. Joining us from the United Nations is CCTV's Liling Tan. Liling, who are some of the leading candidates, and how does this election work exactly?
Hey there, Asiye. Yes, the leading candidate right now is Antonio Guterres, who is the former Prime Minister of Portugal and also the former UN High Commissioner for Refugees. In second and third places are Vuk Jeremic, who is the former Foreign Minister of Serbia, and Miroslav Lajčák, who is the current Foreign Minister of Slovakia. Now, this is the fifth straw poll here by the Security Council, and what that involves is Security Council members get to vote three ways. The first is encourage, the second is discourage, and the third is no opinion. And so far, Guterres has been the consistent front runner. However, Asiye, he is not a shoe-in for the UN's top job just yet. There will be another round of polling in October, and next round, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council can get to veto any candidate that they definitely don't like. And there are a few that aren't exactly favorites. Now, for example, Russia is reportedly not too keen on the Portuguese candidate because he's a member of NATO. And the US is reportedly not too keen on the Serbian candidate because he had previously opposed Kosovo's independence back in the day. So it's still uncertain who will be the man or woman to replace Ban Ki-moon's shoes when he steps down as Secretary General of the United Nations at the end of the year. Asiye?
Liling, let's talk about UN's Sustainable Development Goals, something I talked about at the top of the program. What more can you tell us about that, and did they come up during the General Assembly meeting?
Yes, absolutely. The Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs as they're known here, did come up a lot. In fact, they were the overarching theme during the General Assembly high-level debates, in which we saw world leaders from Africa to Asia, Europe to the Americas talk about how they are implementing targets and also their forward-looking plans on how to reach these targets. Now, the SDGs contain 17 goals that range from endeavors to end poverty and hunger to promoting health, education, gender equality, as you mentioned, as well as climate change. And on that last note, we did see more countries ratify last week that landmark Paris Climate Agreement. So that was a big step forward. Now, also we saw commitments from some countries, an announcement of visions. This was an occasion, a year after the SDGs were officially announced, an occasion for world leaders to lay out their vision and their plans. And from China, we heard Premier Li Keqiang tell the General Assembly during his address on Wednesday that China was among the first few nations that sign on to the SDGs, and that and he also underscored how for development to be sustainable, it needs to be balanced, the gap between the North and South need to be narrowed, and that it cannot be driven by pollution and high consumption. Of course, China also, you recall, China had committed to increasing its annual contribution to the United Nations by $100 million over 2015 levels, and he hopes to reach that target by the year 2020.
All right, Liling Tan reporting from the United Nations. Thank you. Joining us from the United Nations is the former Prime Minister of New Zealand and current administrator of the UN Development Program, Helen Clark. Ms. Clark, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
You've been the head of UNDP for the past 7 years. What do you consider your biggest achievement, and what have been the biggest challenges?
Well, two things. Firstly, having UNDP ranked for the past 2 years as the most transparent aid organisation in the world, I think has been a tremendous achievement. We think that transparency makes us more accountable, it restores and keeps trust in us very, very high. Very pleased with that. Secondly, we were absolutely well positioned for the new Sustainable Development Agenda, and that will, see us through to be very, very relevant to the member states. Biggest challenge is obviously all the big security challenges, peace and security across the Middle East, North African region, some of the issues in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, ongoing challenges in Afghanistan. So we have staff there delivering in very, very difficult and dangerous circumstances.
So you mentioned the sustainable development. Let's expand that a little bit more. An ambitious plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity. 17 sustainable development goals, 169 targets, very ambitious, also a big theme at the G20 summit in Hangzhou. What's been China's role in advancing this program?
Well, firstly, China has signed on to the Sustainable Development Agenda like all other member states. Secondly, it's indicated that it will put quite substantial resource into supporting other countries to achieve the goals. Thirdly, there's so much experience to share between China and other countries. China has seen the greatest rise ever out of poverty in a short period of time, with hundreds of millions of people lifted above the poverty line. So it has so much to share in ways of best practice in these areas. I think China sees working through the United Nations as a big Chinese national priority. China also is a contributor to peacekeeping forces. It's now a very large contributor to the UN's budget. It supplies many talented staff to the organisation. It participates to a highest degree of seriousness in the deliberations of the General Assembly and the Security Council. So sitting where I sit as UNDP administrator, I see China as very engaged with the UN and wanting it to do well.
Let's move on to disasters caused by climate change. We're talking about storms, flooding, droughts, heat waves. What is UNDP doing, Helen, to help countries deal with the increasing risk?
Well, there's two aspects to the climate change response. One is the response to get countries onto a green economy course so that we don't continue to pollute our environment with fossil fuels. That's one thing. For many developing countries, what they're confronted with right now is the here and now of these increasingly bad disasters. And here's the bad news: the weather will keep getting worse for decades until it stabilises if we can meet the Paris Agreement objectives. So UNDP is in on both sides of this work, helping the green economy strategies, policies, practice, implementation, but also working with countries to lift their resilience to these weather-related disasters which are being exacerbated by climate change.
We talked about some of the challenges UNDP faces right now. What about the refugee crisis, Helen? How much is that on the radar of UNDP?
Very much on the radar. If you take, for example, the Syria crisis, firstly, we have worked as hard as we can within Syria with the resources we can get to try to stabilise people in their own country, including the 6.5 million internally displaced Syrians. Secondly, in countries very badly impacted in the neighbourhood, like Turkey, like Jordan, like Lebanon, we've been working with the governments and the local authorities and the host communities, towns and villages, to try to support work and opportunity for both the newcomers and the host communities. We have worked to support tolerance, worked with local leaders, because it's not so difficult for people to whip up resentment against newcomers, and yet people are fleeing from a desperate situation, so they need to be supported. We believe they want the dignity of work and being able to stand on their own feet.
You are running for UN Secretary General. You've said the UN needs your style of leadership. Explain to us what that means exactly. And Helen, what would you bring to the job?
Well, what I would bring to the job is many years of top leadership experience. I served as my own country's Prime Minister for 9 years, been at UNDP for 7. I've been a leader in my region. I know a lot about running things and getting results. I'm very results oriented. The world faces so many challenges. The UN has to step up to be more effective in meeting them. That will require a different style of leadership. It requires the kind of experience that someone like I, as a long-term leader, has had.
Is it time for the United Nations to have a woman at the helm?
Well, after 71 years, many would say so.
Okay, let's talk about the UN Security Council. 5 permanent members, Helen, 10 non-permanent members elected for 2 years. And a lot of people would say it's also time to add more permanent members. Your thoughts?
Well, the member states of the United Nations, all 193 of them, have to come to an agreement about the best way forward. We have a UN which was designed in 1945. That was certainly before I was born, before most of humanity was born. And organizations need to be overhauled. They need to be, renovated. So this debate about the shape of the Security Council, the nature of the permanent membership, this will go on. If, as Secretary General, I can facilitate the debate to help the member states come to some understanding about the way forward, of course I will do that.
What would you tell critics who say the UN has been ineffective?
I think the UN does a tremendous amount of good around the world every day. I head the development arm. Actually, go out country by country. Generally, people have only very, very positive things to say. Positive things to say about the humanitarian response and many, many other areas of our work. But of course, these peace and security issues are extremely challenging. And I think we need to look at them with new eyes as well, because by and large, they're not the challenges that those who drafted the UN Charter in 1945 were thinking of meeting. We're looking at many non-state actors, militias, violent extremist groups. These things have their roots somewhere. Often they have their roots in marginalization, in poverty, in exclusion. So we need to take a broader developmental lens to peace and security. It's not just a military or a strong policing or intelligence response which is going to solve this.
And so many conflict zones around the world. You mentioned Syria, there's also Afghanistan, there's Yemen. In Africa, the fight against Boko Haram, so many competing agendas, so many competing interests by various nations, Helen. How would you bring those countries together on very divisive and sensitive issues?
And that's the job of the Secretary General, to facilitate the member states coming together to solve problems. If you take some of the situations, like Boko Haram affected area around the Lake Chad Basin, I've recently visited North Cameroon. Shortly, we'll be putting together with the World Bank and the European Union, at the request of the government, a plan for recovery when circumstances permit. There's going to need to be a lot of international solidarity to support these communities to come back from where they've been, offer their young people opportunity, get the infrastructure and services in. So what I'm very much emphasizing is we're all in this together. If one community is insecure, in the end, that will have ripple effects for all of us. We've seen this so graphically with the Syria crisis. So the UN must be dedicated to supporting member states to come together to find the answers.
And Helen, if it is not you elected as head of the UN, as a UN Secretary General, and if it's someone else, another woman, would you support her?
Look, whoever the choice of the member states is, I will support. Obviously, my plan A is my own candidacy, and I'm pursuing that extremely hard.
Helen Clark, thank you so much for your time. And we need to take a break. When we come back, we'll talk with 2 leading philanthropists working with the United Nations to help achieve some of those sustainable development goals. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. Sergio Fernandez de Cordova began his entrepreneurial career at the age of 12 by starting a newspaper with his mother in New Jersey. Today, he's also a successful investor, innovator, and philanthropist, and a member of the United Nations Foundation. He joins us from the UN, and also with us from New York is a founder and president of Wellbeing Foundation Africa, Toyin Saraki. For the past 2 decades, she's focused on maternal and child health, ending gender-biased discrimination and violence, and improving education and the lives of people in Africa. Sergio, let's talk about sustainable development goals. I have some of these goals in front of me. No poverty, zero hunger, good health, well-being, good education, gender equality. China has really led the effort in this department. It was the first to submit to the UN its national plan for implementation for the 2030 agenda. China's Premier Li Keqiang spoke at the UN. He told the UN General Assembly the current refugee crisis, poverty, and conflict all could be attributed to insufficient development. Insufficient development. What is your take on it, Sergio?
Well, I think, for my take as an entrepreneur, I think that the Sustainable Development Goals agenda is an incredible opportunity. It's not just for entrepreneurs themselves, but I mean, when you look at, countries like China, where there's now a framework by which to create development opportunities, to create better policy making, to have a standardized, agreed upon, like COP21, framework that allows them to really, change the conversation locally and therefore impact the world internationally.
Toyin, what are the challenges facing women across Africa in terms of their everyday lives?
Well, definitely in Africa, I would say to you that women are not as highly valued as men. It starts from birth. As a girl child, they're already probably saying sorry to your father and saying, all the money you invest on her education is going to go to somebody else's family. But we know that this is not true. Women are nurturers, women are carers, and the most important investment that you can make is to invest in the education of a girl's life, to give her the opportunity and give her rights. We need to have our rights assured. In Nigeria, we're currently struggling, actually, we're fighting to get the Gender Equality and Opportunity Bill passed. And I believe that this was actually initially rejected because of an ambivalence or even a fight back to the idea of women owning property rights and inheritance rights. But we're working on it. I have convened a stakeholders forum to support the Gender Equality and Opportunities Bill, and it's getting a second chance at the Senate next week. We really cannot develop if we leave half of the world behind, and the female gender is half of the world. We need that investment now.
What about progress? Has there been significant progress in Africa and especially in Nigeria when it comes to gender equality in the last 10, 15 years?
Well, it really depends on how you measure the progress. If you're going to be measuring the progress politically, I would say we've had a slight downturn because we've gone down from 12% representation in political positions to just 6% at the current time. But there has been progress that has been made with pockets of excellence. In Kwara State, for instance, there's a 15% female representation in political era. But women are making progress themselves and this is what we need to create, a better connect to government to make sure that this progress registers across the board. I think where it comes to education, most definitely, most Africans now recognize that a girl has an equal right to education with a man or a boy, but poverty is still going to be the one thing that holds us back. And then when you come to the issue of migration and displacement, that knows no gender. Women and children suffer the most in conflict, but the suffering is pretty strong across the board. We're going to need to strengthen basic systems to be able to build the resilience to cope with crisis and with conflict.
You mentioned education, gender equality, poverty, all parts of sustainable development goals. Sergio, some of these goals appear to be highly ambitious. How realistic, how doable are these, especially for Latin America, in places like Venezuela, Sergio, where people can't even find basic goods, they can't even find food?
Well, I think that when you're looking at, how doable are they, I think that, although they're broad and lofty, I think it really goes down to each of the independent economies. I mean, what's exciting about in Latin America is that there's a real opportunity. We just hosted a big summit at the UN of Latin leaders, and to talk about how we're implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda in Latin America, and now Cuba really becoming an incredible opportunity, as well as obviously Venezuela really, there obviously a lot of reform needs to happen there, but the opportunity within the framework of the SDGs in Latin America is something that we're very excited about, because they're not that far behind. And I think that the culture in Latin America really lends itself to an SDG framework, and it is something that is very much embedded in the DNA. It's just a matter of really measuring and executing and really bringing the programs together.
Toyin, let's talk about those young girls who were tragically abducted by Boko Haram, the Chibok schoolgirls in 2014. More than 200 are still missing. Dozens managed to escape. You recently wrote a very passionate article saying, sadly, the Chibok situation is nothing new. Seldom throughout history has armed mobilization not been weaponized to victimize women. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
This is the truth. Wherever you see war or conflict anywhere in the world, women and children bear the brunt of the suffering. Women have always been used as the chattels, the bargaining tools, and this is a crime against humanity. These girls were at school because they were doing their exams. Their parents had made the investment in sending them to school in an area that is not that well resourced or rich, because they wanted them to have a better life, and the route to that better life was through education. And just the thought that somebody somewhere with an abhorrent ideology would grab the girls, take them, and use them to hold an entire country, in fact, to hold humanity hostage. It's just awful, but we will never stop looking for them, and we will look for them until we find them. But it's happening all over the world. It's happening in Syria. It's happened in every country where there's conflict. If you recall the Yazidi situation, again, it was the women and the girls. And this is something that has to stop. It's a crime against humanity, and I hope that we're going to be able to treat it against a crime against humanity. It's just not right.
Sergio, you've spoken about business development in emerging countries. Is there a magic formula here to be able to achieve sustainable development goals that we've been talking about, whether you're in Nigeria or whether you're in Venezuela?
Yes, I think there is. I think that, I'm a huge fan of public-private partnerships, and I think that there is a formula. It's just that we need to start to invest in it. And the biggest problem with the markets is that if no one is doing it and no one is leading the way, then we don't have examples to go off of. And, we're very passionate personally. We have a fund in Mexico where we're looking at eradicating poverty vis-a-vis investing in the community and creating at least, single-digit returns, but being able to do that. And, you have to, show these examples. I spoke at the UNCTAD 14 conference in Kenya, and at that conference we had a keynote panel where I was a younger sort of member of the panel talking about innovative public-private partnerships and why it's important, A, to have the private sector involved in every conversation, B, to have the public sector governance, policy, framework, C, to make sure that we have the NGOs, the social impact leaders, and D, to have the people, civic society, because if we're not doing this to service the people, help the people, and develop platforms that are creating a better world for them, then we're not doing our job from an investment all the way from governance all the way to social impact. And I think that today we look at it as something that's innovative, but to me, in my eyes, it's like it's common sense. How are we not doing this, and how are we not implementing it, and how are we not replicating it? And some of the work that we do with the SDG fund as well is looking at that framework, creating this sort of GP for the LPs to be able to plug in. The general partners create the framework, the document, the paper that allows then a limited partner to come in and actually take a chance at an opportunity. And I think, again, we're in year one. I think this is a long road, and it's a 15-year journey, but it's an opportunity to really showcase examples. And I think from the UN's perspective, I think the responsibility is to really showcase these examples, to show these ideas, to elevate these so that others could actually also replicate them in country, in region, and help facilitate and accelerate the Sustainable Development Goal agenda.
Toyin, let me switch gears and talk a little bit more about something very personal, something that happened to you. You've been open about sharing your heartbreak, losing one of your twins at birth in Nigeria. Could that have been prevented? Talk to us about Nigeria's public healthcare system, and how did that tragic loss shape your advocacy on behalf of other women?
You know, I think it could have been prevented 100%. I was 7 months pregnant and I delivered in a pretty good hospital, but they didn't have my records and I arrived there in a crisis. And the anesthetic just didn't get there in time. So I had one stillbirth and I had one premature child, a 28-weeker. I had to fight for my life and I had to fight for my child's life. And part of that fight was getting the right information, the right medication, and the right techniques to bear on my situation. Now, there were good points that came out of that. I received fantastic care from the medical personnel and very compassionate care from the midwives, which really, really helped, not just my physical health, but also my mental health. But when I came out of it, when I came out on the other side, I was filled with a sense of outrage and realization that what happened to me was an everyday occurrence for hundreds and thousands of women in my country. We lose about 800,000 women a year in childbirth and an equal number of children. That's 1.6 million lives lost every year that is preventable, and it's preventable by simple things. It's having trained medical personnel to meet you at your point of need in a well-equipped medical facility that has all the right tools and medications and records, a history of what you've been through so that they know what to do to you or can even predict what you need in advance. And that's why I started the Wellbeing Foundation in 2004. So the Wellbeing Foundation initially started by helping with access to healthcare. We were literally paying people's hospital bills. And that evolved into a universal healthcare access fund where we partnered with a community health insurance scheme to pay capacitation fees so that patients could actually have a full insurance package of care. But I feel very, very strongly that we need to support health workers. And that is why I accepted the role as Global Goodwill Ambassador to the International Confederation of Midwives, which promotes a midwifery services framework which is centered around the SDGs around the world. We have reached 125,000 women, and the proof is in the pudding. We have not lost one single one of our mothers or newborns that have attended our classes. In the facilities where we have put our EMONC trained midwives, they haven't lost a single life either, which is a complete variance to the national mortality figures.
Tremendous achievements. We so appreciate both of you, Toyin, you for opening your heart, talking about your personal pain as well. Sergio, to you as well. Sergio Fernandez de Cordova, Toyin Saraki, thank you to you both. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Asiye Namdar in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.